So as you all know, and you all who've been visiting with us or gathering, and those of you maybe for the first time here visiting, we do things a little strange in here. We use music that you wouldn't expect necessarily to experience in church. We use quotes and texts from different sacred sources like Rumi to think about what it is that we're about in this space, but all of it resonates or revolves or reveals what we feel is deeply a part of Jesus' life, of what it means to be a follower or Christian in this century, in this age that we're in. And we do it in a kind of unusual way, too, here in the round. And then if you're really thinking, part of the whole process, the madness to this method, is this idea that you're putting together the pieces as we're going along. Not everybody will do it. A lot of people don't even want to do it, and that's okay, too. It's just good music. Enjoy it. But there's always some connection to all of these lyrics, to all of these messages that the lyrics speak to that resonate with the text, and then maybe something else out there that might resonate with you. So this is what we do when we gather, and that's what our series is. Our series is The Art of Gathering, how we do it and why it's important. And so I'm going to speak with you today a little bit about this idea of what do I love when I say I love God? Or what do we love when we say we love God? And I'm using sort of an old idea to get to this place that I hope to go to in 10 minutes, thereabouts. And it comes from St. Augustine, the Bishop of Hippo back in the 4th century, who had written a book called The Confessions. And in the Confessions, he comes to this place early on in the book as he then starts to sort of open up. What is it exactly that I love when I say I love God? And then he goes through this whole series of things that he thinks it's not. And then suddenly he realizes that in a certain way it is. Even though he had first thought that it's not the fragrance of the flowers, it's not the experience of life and its joys, it's not this or that, it's something else more ephemeral. And then he thinks, well, wait a minute, maybe it is all of that, but more in light of with God's presence in illuminating what that's like. But I'm going to just hold you to this one phrase, and I want you to think about it in your own heart. What is it I love when I say I love God? And you probably don't ask yourself that question very often, or you might think about it as being something rather traditional. When I say I love God, it means I do good things. I'm supposed to be a good person. I'm supposed to live a good life. I'm supposed to do the right thing. I want to tell you a quick story. When I was working more often and doing more time, when I was doing time in the main service, when I would do the worship service and help lead over there, it was always interesting to see the acolytes, who'd come down. Sometimes the acolytes were 4th graders, and sometimes they were 5th graders. They're usually between 4th and 6th grade. And I wrote about this a couple of years back. But Michael Johnson, who's one of our staff members' sons, was in the 4th grade. I think he was in 4th grade, and he was going to do the acolyte that day. It was his first time to do it. And I'm sitting up there in the front on the altar, and I'm watching. Of course, we're all dressed in robes, and if you've been in the sanctuary, it's a very majestic, not somewhat Gothic, but just a majestic space. It's just overwhelming with the majesty and beauty of it, and it's kind of dark, and there's candles, and the choir's in their seats all elaborately dressed, and all of us sitting up there in our robes, trying to smile, but we kind of look a little stoic too, all fancied up like that, and here he comes down the aisle in his robe, and he's really walking careful, and Elaine told me, he worked hard. He was like, I'm going to get this right. And so he rehearsed it several times. During the week he was there rehearsing the whole walking down the aisle. And he gets down to the end of the aisle where he's going to light the candle with the tapers. And he's carrying it very carefully. And he's literally marking his steps as he gets to that candle. And then he stops right in front of the candle and looks up with like a deer in headlights at us sitting there. And he says, holy cow, I've been waiting for this all my life. Lights the candles, then turns around with a big smile and makes his way back up with just a little more skip in the step. A couple of months later, I'm doing time in the sanctuary. I like that phrase. And I'm sitting there, and it's Lynn Deloney's daughter, And I asked if that's okay if I talk about them. They said, that's fine. But it's Len Deloney's daughter, Anna, who many of you know Anna. Anna's now on the wrestling team at Oklahoma City University, and she's also doing great and doing some scholastic stuff. Just an interesting and wonderful person. Back then, when she was in the 4th and 5th grade, you might have noticed her because she usually wore as many dissonant pieces of clothing as she could find. So she'd have a red tennis shoe and a loafer, or she'd have a painted rainbow shoe and then something else on the other foot, or occasionally just walk around with a sock and a shoe. And then she'd be wearing different outfits, the pants, then a dress over the pants, and then her hair would be different colors. And then on this occasion, I think her head was shaved on one side and her hair was purple on the other side. And Elaine had asked her, and she said, I remember when she said she'd do it, she's like, yeah, whatever, okay. And so they gave her didn't rehearse. She shows up at the last minute, and her robe is sort of somewhat unbuttoned, kind of unzipped, and she's got the taper slung over her shoulder, and she kind of skips down the aisle, and then smiles at me because I know her well, and Linda and I are godparents, and she kind of smiles with that I'm here and you're here, and it's like family. And then she lights the candles, and then she looks at the taper for the longest time because that's something she didn't rehearse. And then she thinks, how do I turn this thing off? And then finally, she figures it out. We're all going like this, we're all going like this. And she finally pulls the lever down, and she goes like that. And then she turns around, and she sort of skips her way back up the aisle. And I think that there's something interesting to think about this when we think about what it is that worship is all about and what we do when we are at worship. And I want to hold these two images in our minds. Because kids, they're just two examples of kids, right? And most of our families, we got examples of these kids, right? They're on different spectrums of life. They represent different aspects and perspectives in life. Neither's right nor wrong, but both of them sort of carry a message about what I think it is and what we sometimes miss that we're doing here. When we get to the text, we're looking at Jesus with a Samaritan woman. A couple of things are happening. He's not supposed to be there. He shouldn't be talking to this woman. She's at the well getting water. He goes to get water too. The disciples are probably standing off to the side, and they're probably wondering why this is all taking place. I'm not even going to go to the whole issue of this patriarchal kind of text and talk about it's a blaming the victim kind of story, because we could go there. But I want to think more about what Jesus says to her when she starts to defend this whole theological orientation between her people, the Samaritans, and where God is supposed to be worshipped, and his people, the Jews, or the true chosen Jews, and where they're supposed to worship, and then what he tells them, what he says basically above all of that, what he basically says eliminates both of those scenarios. She says we are to worship in the mountain. That's where we worship, where we find God. And then she says, but then you Jews, the traditional, the Judaism today, in her time, worships in the temple and finds God there. And his response is, it's in neither place, because it will come a time where worship is going to be in spirit, and we experience God in spirit, and we worship in spirit and truth. And then as she continues in this discussion, it begins to illuminate her stories. And if you remember the story, she's been married a number of times, and she's not married at the current time, and she says she is, and he corrects her, and he knows all about her story. And it goes on and for a while until she says, I have water, I can give you water. And then he says to her, you don't need this water, I can give you the water of life. And she wants that water of life. All of this story, I think, illuminates for us something about what it is to worship, why we gather, what it is we're doing here. But more than that, I think it speaks even to this deeper issue of why are you here? Why am I here? What is it that I love when I say I love God? And that's a tricky phrase, because for some of us, we've kind of gotten here because we found ourselves leaving scenarios, churches where we felt maybe a little oppressed because of the language or because of some behavior, or perhaps where we are in our faith journey, many of us in what Richard Rohr would call that second phase, that second half of spirituality. spirituality, where now we're looking much more deeply at what it even means to be a person of faith. What are these old creedal ideas that we used to assent to almost religiously, just in a kind of routine way? Now what do they mean, or do they mean anything? For me to say, what do you love when you say you love God, that may even be a tricky phrase. So I want to play with that for a second and ask you to think of it in this way. I want you to think of what Jesus was saying when he says we worship in spirit. Keep in mind also the Gospel of John's written in about 110, 115 AD, so it's like 80 years, 70 years after Jesus' death. It's another 50 years after the fall of the temple. So the temple has fallen. So in a sense, the story's already saying what Jesus says will happen. The temple's already gone. And so they already are scattered, and they're worshiping in homes. They're gathering in small spaces. Now, again, think to yourself about traditional worship, which is this majestic space that is overwhelming, in this sense of the majestic, and where we are now. Why do we do this? Why are we worshiping this way? Part of the intention behind this, of course, for us is this idea that we are here together, that we experience God in one another, that we experience God as the ground of our being, as Paul the Apostle wrote to the Romans in the book of Acts. We experience God in this very rootedness of our being. So let's go back then and think about spirit as breath, as the very source of life. Think of God as ground of being, and then ask ourselves, what is it that I love when I say I love the ground of my being? And then it gets tricky for a couple of reasons. One, I'm not sure we ask ourselves that question very much. And two, I'm not sure we love the ground of our being. What is it that you love? You love a good pie? You love a good song, good music? You love a good band? You love your car? You hate your car. Your car is the bane of your existence now. You love your house. You love your kids. You love your wife, or you love your husband. You love your partner. Think of all the ways in which we say, I love. What is it that I love? I think as we approach these things, we begin to see a little bit more about what it means to love at the depth of our being. Because that's not what I'm talking about, how we love something, how we love someone. Over time, we learn that loving someone isn't exactly what we expected. It requires more of us. It requires more of our essence. It requires more of our vulnerability. It requires more of our brokenness. And love becomes more of a journey than an actual experience or an actual object. So what does it mean for me to say, I love God? What do I say I love? Is it already 5 till? Are we already there? Yeah, we're already getting there. Naomi Shihab Nye has this wonderful poem, and I'm going to just share a couple of things from this poem with you and then bring some of these ideas to a closure as the band's getting up here. She has a wonderful poem called Famous. I think it speaks to what it is that we are called to love, what we're invited to love when we love the ground of our being. The boot is famous to the earth, more famous than the dress is famous to the dress shoe is famous to the floors. The bent photograph is famous to the one who carries it, but not at all famous to the one who is pictured. I want to be famous to shuffling men who smile while crossing streets, sticky children in grocery lines, famous as the one who smiled back. I want to be famous the way a pulley is famous, or a buttonhole, not because it did anything spectacular, but because it never forgot what it could do. I think what happens when we gather to worship is that we begin to discover something. As we connect with the ground of our being in a more vulnerable and honest way, something happens with this idea of, I love God. Something begins to happen that's so rich and so deep that it's no longer, I love God, it suddenly just becomes, I love. So I want to invite you to think this week. As you move through the week, I want you to think of all the ways in which we are invited to pay attention to one another. But when we pay attention, what I want to invite you to do is to take that deep breath before you even encounter, before you even engage, and to let it out. And then take another breath and to let it out. And just remind yourself, I'm breathing. You're breathing. We're sharing this sacred gift of spirit. We share the same ground of being. And then the second thing I want you to do is take another deep breath. And as you do, I want you to say, I am glad you're here. Not to them. I mean, you can say that, but I want you to say that in your head and let it out. And I want you to say it again. What this does is something pretty unusual and profound, I think. It reminds us we're not there for our agenda. To share in the ground of being begins with being here for one another. Trusting that, in fact, even where we experience discomfort, we share the ground of God's being with one another. And the only way that we can get there sometimes is like what Rumi says when he says, stop seeking for love, right? Stop seeking for love. Seek instead for all the barriers we put up in resistance to it. Seek instead for ways we can let go of those things that we might experience the love that's already present. Take some breaths. Remember that we are here rooted in God's being and that we share that with one another. I'll close with this last thought. If you read the book, The Brothers Karamazov, you remember a scene where the elder Zosima, and I'm mispronouncing his name, but where he talks to Ivan the Doubter. He says this about loving God. Love all God's creation, both the whole of it and every grain of sand. Love every leaf, love every light. Love animals and plants, love each one. And if you love each one, you will begin to perceive the something of God's mystery in all things, in all people. And once you have perceived that you are in the presence of God's mystery because you have loved first, you will begin to perceive more and more of it every day, and at last you will come to love the whole world with a single, universal love. Carl Jung said, life is short. It's a pause between two great mysteries. What do you love when you say you love God?